The sound of the school bell echoed through Brookhaven High as students poured into the hallways, their chatter and laughter blending into a chaotic symphony. Jake Miller lingered near his locker, his movements methodical as he avoided making eye contact with anyone. He was a 17-year-old who had mastered the art of invisibility, preferring to disappear into the pages of his books rather than draw attention to himself. But his efforts to remain unnoticed were futile against the likes of Jonas and his gang. Jonas, a towering figure with a mean streak as sharp as his smirk, sauntered past, his cronies trailing behind. "Hey, bookworm!" Jonas sneered, slamming Jake's locker shut. The metallic clang reverberated through the hallway. "What are you hiding from today?" Jake clenched his fists but kept his head down. Confrontation wasn't his style. It never had been. He muttered an excuse and slipped past them, feeling their mocking laughter chase him down the hall. Jake's only sanctuary was the library, where he could immerse himself in novels that carried him far from the suffocating reality of high school. There, he'd often find solace with Liam, his best and only friend. Liam was a wiry kid with a quick wit, the kind of person who could make Jake laugh even on his worst days. "Let me guess," Liam said as Jake dropped into the chair opposite him. "Jonas again?" Jake nodded. "It's nothing I can't handle." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. At home, Jake's reprieve was short-lived. His younger sister, Emily, had always been his source of strength, her bubbly personality a stark contrast to his introverted nature. But tonight, as he passed by her room, he heard muffled sobs. "Emily!" Jake pushed the door open to find her curled up on her bed, her face buried in her hands. She looked up, her tear-streaked cheeks glowing in the dim light. "It's Jonas," she whispered. He waits for me after school. Says things that scare me." Jake's chest tightened with a mixture of anger and guilt. The thought of Jonas targeting Emily ignited a flame he had fought to keep extinguished for years. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I didn't want to worry you," she said. Jake sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I won't let him hurt you," he promised, though he wasn't sure how he could keep his word. The following day brought more humiliation. In the cafeteria, Jonas tripped Liam as he carried his lunch tray, sending food flying. "Oops," Jonas said with mock innocence as laughter erupted around them. Liam tried to shrug it off, but Jake could see the embarrassment etched on his face. "It's fine," Liam muttered as Jake helped him clean up. But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. That afternoon, the situation escalated. As Jake waited for Liam outside the school, he heard shouts from the parking lot. Racing over, he found Jonas and his friends surrounding Liam, who was on the ground clutching his side. Blood trickled from a split lip, and his glasses lay shattered nearby. "Leave him alone," Jake shouted, his voice breaking. Jonas turned, a smug grin plastered on his face. "Or what? You gonna fight me, Miller?" Jake's hands trembled with a mix of fear and fury. He knelt beside Liam as Jonas and his gang sauntered away, laughing. "Come on," Jake said, helping Liam to his feet. "We need to get you to a hospital." Later that evening, Jake found himself standing outside an old, weathered building, the dojo where he had trained in martial arts as a child. It had been years since he last stepped foot inside, but the memories came rushing back. The scent of sweat and wood polish filled his nostrils as he entered. The walls were lined with photographs of Master Kimura, a stoic yet kind man who had been more than a teacher to Jake. He had instilled in him a philosophy that went beyond combat. Strength came from control, not aggression. Jake's gaze fell on the worn punching bag in the corner. As he approached it, he remembered Kimura's voice. Every strike must have purpose, every movement intention. He hesitated before delivering a tentative punch. The bag swung lightly, and with it, Jake's resolve grew. Over the next hours, Jake worked tirelessly, his movements becoming more precise as the teachings he had long buried resurfaced. But with each punch and kick, doubt gnawed at him. Could he reconcile the man Kimura had taught him to be with the anger that now consumed him? At home, Rachel, Jake's mother, was growing increasingly worried. She had taken on extra shifts at the diner to provide for her children after her husband's untimely death, but the strain was evident. "You're distant, Jake," she said one evening as they sat at the dinner table. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Jake lied. Rachel wasn't convinced. "I know you're struggling. And I know it's hard to step up when you're scared, but sometimes we don't have a choice. Your father," she paused, her voice cracking. "He was kind like you. But kindness didn't save him when the world demanded more." Her words lingered in Jake's mind long after the conversation ended. He saw himself in the stories Rachel shared about his father, a man who had avoided confrontation until it cost him everything. Jake vowed not to repeat the same mistakes. As the days passed, Jake grew more determined. He returned to the dojo nightly, channeling his frustration into his training. But he also began to notice things he had overlooked before: the way Rachel's hands trembled from exhaustion, the fear that lingered in Emily's eyes, the vulnerability hidden behind Liam's jokes. Each of them depended on him in ways he hadn't realized. And as much as he hated the idea of violence, Jake began to understand that standing idly by was no longer an option. In the dim light of the dojo one night, Jake looked at his reflection in the mirrored wall. He didn't see the timid boy who had spent years fading into the background. He saw someone stronger, someone ready to fight, not just for himself, but for the people he loved. And for the first time, he felt ready to face Jonas. The streets of Brookhaven were deserted as Jake walked home from the library late one evening. The air was crisp, and the faint hum of distant traffic filled the silence. His backpack was slung over one shoulder, heavy with books that had become his refuge from the growing storm in his life. But tonight, he wasn't entirely lost in thought. A lingering unease prickled at the back of his neck, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. As he turned a corner into a narrow alley that served as a shortcut home, he heard footsteps quicken behind him. He spun around to see Jonas flanked by two of his lackeys, their faces lit with predatory amusement. "Well, well, if it isn't the dojo kid," Jonas said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Been hiding in your books and dusty gym long enough, don't you think?" Jake's heart raced, but he refused to let his fear show. "What do you want, Jonas?" he asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. Jonas grinned, stepping closer. "Just a friendly chat. Thought we'd make sure you understand the consequences of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Before Jake could respond, one of Jonas's friends lunged at him. Instinct kicked in. Jake sidestepped the attack, his movements fluid from hours of training. He planted his foot and delivered a precise strike to the assailant's stomach, sending him sprawling. "Lucky shot," Jonas growled, motioning for the other lackey to attack. This time, Jake was ready. He parried the wild swing of a fist, gripping the attacker's arm and twisting it into a hold before shoving him back. The second lackey stumbled, his confidence shaken. Jonas, however, remained unfazed. He clapped slowly, his smirk widening. "Not bad, Miller. Looks like the dojo wasn't a waste of time after all." "Leave me alone," Jake said, his voice firm. "This doesn't have to get worse." "Oh, it will," Jonas replied, his eyes glinting with malice. He stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. But before he could act, the distant wail of a siren broke through the tension. "Another time," Jonas spat, retreating into the shadows with his cronies. "This isn't over." When Jake arrived home, his hands trembled as he unlocked the door. He had managed to fend them off, but the encounter left him rattled. He didn't want Emily or Rachel to see him like this, so he headed straight to the bathroom to inspect the bruises forming on his arms. Rachel, however, wasn't so easily fooled. As Jake sat at the dinner table later, picking at his food, she noticed his hunched posture and the faint discoloration peeking from under his sleeve. "What happened?" she asked, her tone leaving no room for evasion. "Nothing," Jake said too quickly, averting his gaze. "Don't lie to me," Rachel pressed. "You're my son. I can see when something's wrong." Jake sighed, his resolve crumbling under her worried stare. "Jonas," he admitted quietly. "He and his friends cornered me." Rachel's expression shifted from concern to anger. "This has gone too far. I'm calling the school." "No," Jake interrupted, his voice rising. That'll only make it worse. I can handle it. Rachel's face softened as she reached across the table to hold his hand. You don't have to carry this alone, Jake. You have a family that loves you. Jake nodded, but his mind was already racing. He couldn't let his family bear the weight of his battles. The next day, Jake returned to the dojo. The musty air and creaking floorboards felt like a second home now, a place where he could focus and hone his skills. He worked tirelessly, his movements sharper, his strikes more calculated. The image of Jonas's smirk fueled his determination, but so did Rachel's words, "You're not alone." Later that afternoon, Liam showed up at Jake's house, his arm in a sling but his usual grin intact. "Heard you played hero last night," he said, dropping onto the couch beside Jake. "It wasn't heroic," Jake replied. "I just didn't have a choice." Liam's smile faded. "Well, you're not facing them alone again. I don't care how banged up I am." Jake frowned. "Liam, you're hurt. You can't." "I can and I will," Liam cut him off. "You've always had my back, Jake. Let me have yours for once." Jake hesitated, torn between gratitude and fear for his friend's safety. "Just promise me you won't do anything reckless." "Reckless is my middle name," Liam joked, though the resolve in his eyes was clear. Meanwhile, across town, Jonas sat in his uncle's garage, nursing a beer as his uncle, a burly ex-convict named Marty, regaled him with stories of bar fights and back-alley showdowns. "You want to be respected, kid?" Marty said, slapping Jonas on the back. "You gotta show them who's boss. Don't just scare them, break them." Jonas absorbed his uncle's words like gospel, his anger toward Jake festering into a need for revenge. "Next time, I'll finish what I started," he muttered, his knuckles tightening around the bottle. The tension reached a boiling point when Jonas escalated his threats against Emily. One afternoon, as she left school, she found him leaning against his car, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Hey, Miller's sister," he called, flicking the cigarette onto the pavement. "Tell your brother he's running out of time." Emily froze, her heart pounding as Jonas stepped closer. Before he could say more, a teacher appeared, and Jonas slinked away, but the encounter left Emily shaken. That evening, she told Jake what happened, her voice trembling. "He said he's not done with you." "I'm scared, Jake." Jake's anger boiled over, but he masked it with a comforting smile. "Don't worry, Em. I'll make sure he never comes near you again." As the days passed, Jake's training intensified. He spent hours practicing, not just for strength but for control. He recalled Kimura's words, "A fight is not about destruction. It's about resolution." But deep down, Jake knew that resolution with someone like Jonas might only come through confrontation. Late one night, Jake's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Meet me in the parking lot tomorrow after school. Alone. Let's settle this." Jake stared at the screen, his mind racing. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. He took a deep breath, his fists clenching as he whispered to himself, "It ends tomorrow." The following morning, the air was thick with tension as Jake prepared for the day ahead. His mind replayed the anonymous message from the night before, "Meet me in the parking lot. Alone." He knew it could only be Jonas. The confrontation loomed like a storm cloud, and despite all his training, Jake felt the weight of uncertainty pressing on his chest. At the breakfast table, Emily watched him silently. Her usually bright demeanor was subdued, her eyes shadowed by worry. Rachel moved about the kitchen, oblivious to the unspoken tension between her children. Jake pushed his food around his plate, unable to eat. "You're going to be late for school," Rachel said, glancing at the clock. Jake stood, grabbing his bag. "I'll see you later," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. Emily caught his arm as he walked past. "Jake, what are you planning to do?" she asked in a whisper, her voice trembling. "Whatever it takes to keep you safe," he replied, gently squeezing her hand before heading out the door. School felt like a blur. The noise of the hallways, the chatter of classmates, it all faded into the background as Jake's thoughts raced. By the time the final bell rang, he was no closer to resolving the conflict within himself. As he walked to the parking lot, The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt. Jonas was there, leaning against his car with a smug expression. His gang was scattered nearby, their presence an unspoken threat despite the message's demand for Jake to come alone. "Right on time," Jonas called, straightening up as Jake approached. "I'm here," Jake said, his voice steady despite the unease bubbling inside him. "Let's settle this." Jonas grinned, stepping forward. "Oh, we'll settle it. But first, let me make something clear. You don't scare me, Miller. No amount of karate moves or dojo lessons changes that." Jake's fists clenched, but he held his ground. "This isn't about scaring anyone, Jonas. It's about stopping you." The gang began to circle, their laughter a low murmur of anticipation. Jake's gaze darted around, calculating his options. His instincts told him to wait, to let Jonas make the first move. "What's the matter, hero?" Jonas taunted. "Afraid to hit first?" Jake said nothing, his silence drawing a frustrated growl from Jonas. With a sudden burst of motion, Jonas lunged. The fight was brutal from the outset. Jonas's swings were wild but powerful, each one aimed to overpower rather than precision. Jake dodged and countered, his movements controlled and deliberate. He could hear the jeers from the gang, but he shut them out, focusing entirely on the fight. Jonas landed a blow to Jake's side, sending him stumbling back. Pain flared, but Jake recovered quickly, remembering Kimura's teachings: stay grounded. Don't let pain dictate your next move. Jake retaliated with a calculated strike to Jonas's shoulder, causing him to stagger. The gang grew restless, one of them stepping forward as if to intervene, but Jonas barked, "Stay out of it." The fight continued, each exchange more intense than the last. Jake's training gave him an edge, but Jonas's sheer brute force made every moment a struggle. At that moment, Jake felt the weight of a deeper battle, the struggle between his values and the reality of violence. Kimura's words echoed in his mind: "Force without control is just chaos." Jake didn't want to win this fight by destroying Jonas. He wanted to end the cycle of aggression. As Jonas lunged again, Jake sidestepped and grabbed his arm, locking it behind his back. "This ends now," Jake said firmly, his voice filled with resolve. Jonas writhed, trying to break free. "Not until I'm done with you," he spat. "Look around," Jake said, nodding toward the gathered students who had formed an impromptu audience. "This isn't just about us anymore. You think they're laughing with you? They're laughing at you." Jonas froze, his eyes darting to the crowd. For the first time, Jake saw something crack in his adversary's facade, a flicker of vulnerability. Before either of them could say more, the sharp blast of a whistle cut through the air. The school's principal, Mr. Hammond, stormed toward the group, his face a mask of fury. "What is going on here?" he demanded, his voice echoing across the lot. The gang scattered, and Jonas yanked his arm free from Jake's hold. "Nothing," Jonas muttered, his bravado replaced by a sullen glare. Jake stepped forward. "It's my fault, sir. Save it," Mr. Hammond snapped. "Both of you, my office. Now." The walk to the principal's office was tense. Jonas refused to meet Jake's gaze, and Jake wrestled with the aftermath of their fight. Once inside, Mr. Hammond gestured for them to sit. "I don't care what your issues are," the principal began. "Fighting on school grounds is unacceptable. You're both lucky I don't expel you right now." Jonas shifted uncomfortably, but Jake spoke up. "It won't happen again," he said, his tone sincere. Mr. Hammond narrowed his eyes. "It better not. You're both suspended for a week. Use that time to think about your actions." Jake nodded, accepting the punishment without argument. He glanced at Jonas, who sat stiffly, his jaw tight. That evening, Jake returned home, his body aching but his mind clearer than it had been in days. Rachel was waiting for him in the living room, her arms crossed. "You're suspended?" she asked, her tone equal parts anger and worry. Jake nodded. "It's complicated, Mom. But it's over now." Rachel sighed, sitting beside him. "Jake, you've always been a good kid. But fighting, that's not who you are." "I know," Jake said quietly, But I couldn't stand by anymore. I had to protect Emily, protect Liam, protect us. Rachel's expression softened, and she pulled him into a hug. Just promise me you'll be careful. I can't lose you too. Jake closed his eyes, the weight of the day settling over him. I promise. As he lay in bed that night, Jake replayed the fight in his mind. He hadn't emerged victorious in the traditional sense, but he had stood his ground. More importantly, he had stayed true to himself. But something told him this wasn't the end. Jonas's vulnerability, the unease in his eyes, it hinted at a deeper conflict yet to be resolved. And Jake knew that his journey, like the fight, was far from over. The school parking lot was eerily quiet as Jake approached, the faint hum of a nearby highway the only sound piercing the stillness. Dusk had fallen, bathing the asphalt in shades of orange and purple. Jonas stood in the center of the lot, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. Around him, 5 others loomed, their faces set in masks of mockery and menace. Jake inhaled deeply, his heart pounding in his chest as he stepped into the open. His breath misted in the cool air, but his resolve burned hot. He wasn't just fighting for himself tonight. He was fighting for Emily, for Liam, and for the part of himself that refused to yield to fear. This ends here, Jake said, his voice steady despite the knots twisting in his stomach. Jonas smirked, rolling his shoulders like a predator sizing up its prey. You're outnumbered, Miller. You sure about that? Jake didn't respond. Words wouldn't end this, only action would. The first attack came from one of Jonas's lackeys, a wiry teen with quick movements but little skill. He rushed at Jake, his fists swinging wildly. Jake sidestepped the first punch, his body moving fluidly as he countered with a precise strike to the attacker's ribs. The teen crumpled, gasping for air. Another assailant came at him from the side, larger and slower than the first. Jake dropped low, sweeping the attacker's legs out from under him. The man hit the ground hard, groaning as he rolled to the side. Impressive, Jonas called, clapping slowly. But let's see how long you can keep this up. 2 more rushed Jake simultaneously. He shifted his stance, recalling the drills he had practiced tirelessly at the dojo. One swung a metal pipe, aiming for Jake's head. Jake ducked, the pipe whooshing past his ear, and drove his elbow into the attacker's sternum. As the second man tried to grab him from behind, Jake twisted free, slamming his palm into the man's chest with enough force to send him staggering backward. Jonas watched, his expression darkening as his crew fell one by one. Is that all you've got? Jake said, his voice edged with defiance. Jonas's smirk vanished. He motioned for the last of his friends to stand down. This one's mine, he said, stepping forward. The crowd of students that had gathered to watch the spectacle fell silent. Tension hung thick in the air as Jonas and Jake squared off. Jonas swung first, his fists like sledgehammers. Jake dodged, but not entirely. A glancing blow caught his shoulder, sending a sharp jolt of pain down his arm. He gritted his teeth, staying light on his feet as Jonas pressed the attack. Each punch Jonas threw was fueled by raw aggression, but Jake's training gave him the edge. He blocked, ducked, and countered with precision, each movement calculated to minimize damage. You think you're better than me? Jonas snarled, his voice trembling with rage. Always playing the hero, always acting like you're above it all. This isn't about me being better, Jake said, dodging another swing. It's about stopping you from hurting anyone else. Jonas roared in frustration, lunging with a ferocity that sent Jake stumbling. Jonas seized the moment, grabbing a nearby folding chair and swinging it with reckless abandon. Time seemed to slow as the chair arced toward Jake. Before it could connect, a figure darted into the fray. Liam, his arm still in a sling, shoved Jake out of the way and took the brunt of the blow. The sound of metal against bone echoed through the lot as Liam crumpled to the ground. No! Jake yelled, rushing to his friend's side. Liam groaned, clutching his ribs, but managed a weak grin. Told you! I wouldn't let you face this alone. Rage boiled in Jake's chest as he stood, his eyes locking onto Jonas. That's enough, he said, his voice low and deadly. Jonas hesitated, the chair slipping from his grip as Jake advanced. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Jake disarmed Jonas with a swift movement, sending the larger teen staggering backward. Jake didn't stop there. He drove Jonas to the ground, pinning him with a hold that left him unable to move. "It doesn't have to be this way," Jake said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Shut up." Jonas spat, though his struggles grew weaker. "You're not a monster, Jonas." "Stop acting like one," Jake said. "This fight isn't going to fix whatever you're dealing with." Jonas's breath came in ragged gasps, and for a moment, his defiance flickered. "What would you know about it?" he muttered. "More than you think," Jake replied. He released Jonas and stood, extending a hand to help him up. Jonas stared at the offered hand, his face a mask of confusion and anger. Slowly, he took it, rising unsteadily to his feet. The sound of sirens cut through the silence as police cars pulled into the lot. The principal, Mr. Hammond, emerged from one of the cars, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. "What in the world is going on here?" he demanded. Students scattered as the police officers began questioning the onlookers. Jake stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of compliance. "It's over," he said, his voice calm but weary. The aftermath was a blur of police reports and stern lectures from the principal. Jonas and his gang faced consequences for their actions, but Mr. Hammond pulled Jake aside after the dust settled. "You've got guts, Miller," the principal said. "But if you ever pull a stunt like this again, you'll be expelled." "Understood." "Yes, sir," Jake replied, the weight of the night settling over him. Back at home, Rachel and Emily waited anxiously as Jake walked through the door, bruised and battered but alive. Rachel rushed to him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "What happened?" she asked, her voice breaking. "It's over," Jake said simply, his words a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Emily hugged him next, her tears soaking into his shirt. "I was so scared," she whispered. Jake rested a hand on her head, his voice gentle. "You don't have to be scared anymore. I promise." As the night wore on, Jake sat alone in his room, reflecting on the events that had brought him here. He hadn't wanted to fight, but he had done what was necessary to protect those he loved. Kimura's teachings echoed in his mind. Strength is not about domination. It's about control. It's about knowing when to stop. And tonight, Jake had found that strength. But deep down, he knew the journey wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The aftermath of the parking lot brawl rippled through Brookhaven High like a stone dropped in still water. By the time Jake returned to school after his suspension, he found the atmosphere had shifted. Hallways once filled with whispered taunts now greeted him with murmurs of respect and curiosity. Students who had previously ignored him now acknowledged his presence with nods or cautious smiles. Jake couldn't help but feel uneasy about the change. He hadn't sought admiration or approval. All he wanted was to protect the people he cared about. Yet, as he walked to his first class, he felt the weight of dozens of eyes following his every move. During lunch, Jake made his way to the hospital to visit Liam. The sterile scent of disinfectant filled his nose as he entered the room, finding his friend propped up in bed, a tray of untouched food on his lap. "Look who's finally off the bench," Liam quipped, a grin spreading across his bruised face. Jake chuckled, pulling up a chair beside him. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a chair," Liam replied, wincing as he shifted. "But I'll live. What about you? Heard you're the school's new hero." Jake's smile faded. "I'm no hero. I just did what I had to do." Liam studied him for a moment before speaking. "You know, not everyone would have stood up the way you did. You've got something most people don't, courage and a conscience." "That's rare, Jake." Jake shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure I deserve that. You got hurt because of me." Liam reached out, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. "We both knew what we were getting into. Don't carry this alone, okay? We've got each other's backs." At home, Jake found Emily and Rachel waiting for him in the living room. Emily's face lit up when she saw him, her usual energy returning little by little. "Guess what?" she said, holding up a flyer. The school's organizing an anti-bullying campaign. They want you to speak. Jake blinked, caught off guard. Me? Why? Because what you did matters, Rachel interjected, her voice warm but firm. You stood up to something a lot of people are too scared to face. That means something, Jake. He hesitated, the idea of standing in front of a crowd making his stomach twist. I don't think I'm the right person for that. You are, Rachel said, her gaze steady. Sometimes, the people who don't think they're leaders are the ones who inspire the most. The following week, Jake found himself at the school's gymnasium, the flyer now a reality. Rows of students filled the bleachers, their chatter a dull roar. As Jake stepped onto the stage, the noise died down, replaced by a heavy silence. He gripped the edges of the podium, his palms clammy. I'm not here to talk about being a hero, he began, his voice steady but soft. Because I'm not one. I made mistakes, and I've hurt people. But what I've learned is that standing up to someone like Jonas doesn't mean fighting back with your fists. It means showing them a different way, a way that doesn't rely on fear or pain. The audience listened intently, the weight of his words sinking in. Jake glanced toward the back of the room, where Jonas stood, his expression unreadable. I'm not proud of everything that happened, Jake continued. But I am proud that I didn't let fear control me. And I hope that from now on, none of you will let fear control you either. As he stepped down from the stage, applause erupted. It wasn't the thunderous ovation of a hero's welcome, but it was genuine, a sign that his message had reached them. In the days that followed, Jonas's behavior began to shift. He no longer roamed the halls with his gang, and the sneering smirk he once wore like armor had disappeared. One afternoon, Jake found him waiting outside the dojo, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. What are you doing here? Jake asked, his tone cautious but not unkind. Jonas shuffled his feet, avoiding eye contact. I wanted to talk. About that night. Jake crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. Go on. Jonas hesitated before speaking. You were right. About me, about everything. I've been angry for so long I didn't know how to be anything else. But after what happened, I don't want to be that guy anymore. Jake studied him, searching for sincerity. It's not going to be easy, he said finally. Changing never is. I know, Jonas replied. But I've got to start somewhere. Jake stepped aside, gesturing toward the dojo. Then start here. The dojo soon became a sanctuary, not just for Jake and Jonas, but for others seeking strength and guidance. With the help of Kimura, Jake began teaching classes, passing on the lessons he had learned. Emily joined as well, her confidence blossoming with each session. Even Liam, once a skeptic of anything resembling discipline, became a regular participant. You'd better not make me wear one of those belts, he joked one evening, earning a laugh from the group. Jonas, too, found a place among them. Though his path to redemption was far from complete, he showed up every day, willing to put in the work. He and Jake rarely spoke of their past, but their mutual understanding grew with each shared practice. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Jake sat on the dojo steps, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Kimura joined him, his weathered face softening with a rare smile. You've come a long way, Jake, Kimura said. But remember, the journey never truly ends. There will always be new challenges, new battles to face. Jake nodded, the weight of those words settling comfortably on his shoulders. As long as I have the people I care about by my side, I think I'll be ready. Kimura placed a hand on his shoulder. That's all any of us can hope for. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Jake felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. He wasn't the same boy who had once faded into the background. He was someone stronger, someone who had faced his fears and come out on the other side, not unscathed, but whole. And for the first time, Jake allowed himself to believe that the future, no matter how uncertain, was something worth fighting for. The soft hum of chatter filled the dojo as students lined up for their evening class. Jake stood at the front, tying his black belt with steady hands. The dojo had transformed over the weeks, becoming a hub not just for martial arts but for growth, resilience, and understanding. The walls bore the marks of hours of practice and hard-won lessons, a testament to the collective strength of those who stepped through its doors. Among the students were familiar faces: Emily, whose newfound confidence radiated in every movement; Liam, cracking jokes as he tightened his wrist wraps; and even Jonas, whose sharp edges had softened with each passing day. Jake scanned the room, his chest swelling with pride as he prepared to begin. "All right, everyone," he called, his voice carrying easily over the murmurs. "Let's get started." The session was demanding, as always. Jake pushed the group to their limits, blending physical drills with lessons on discipline and restraint. He moved between students, correcting stances and offering encouragement. When the session ended, a round of applause erupted as students began gathering their belongings. Emily approached Jake, her face flushed but beaming. "That was amazing," she said. "You're really good at this, you know." Jake chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Don't let it go to my head." As the students filed out, Jonas lingered near the mats, his expression contemplative. Jake approached him, sensing there was something on his mind. "Everything okay?" Jake asked. Jonas hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just thanks for giving me a chance to be here." Jake smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. "Everyone deserves a chance to change, Jonas. What matters is what you do with it." Later that night, Jake sat at the kitchen table, a warm glow from the overhead light illuminating the space. Rachel joined him, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. "You've built something incredible," Rachel said, setting a mug in front of him. Jake shrugged, taking a sip. "It wasn't just me. A lot of people helped make this happen." Rachel reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You've always been stronger than you give yourself credit for, Jake. Your father would be so proud." The mention of his father brought a lump to Jake's throat, but it was a comforting thought rather than a painful one. "I just hope I can keep making a difference," he said quietly. Rachel's smile was soft but unwavering. "You already have." The next day, the school held an assembly to recognize the efforts of the anti-bullying campaign. Jake had been invited to speak again, though this time, he felt more at ease. The gymnasium was packed with students and teachers, their attention fixed on the stage as Jake stepped up to the podium. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he began, his voice steady. "But it starts with a single decision. The decision to be better, to do better. That's a choice we can all make, no matter where we come from or what we've done." His words resonated, and as he glanced around the room, he saw nods of agreement. Even Jonas, sitting near the back, seemed to absorb the message. When the applause came, it was louder than before, a sign not just of approval but of hope. Jake stepped down, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. That evening, back at the dojo, Jake prepared for a special class. The usual students were joined by members of the community, parents, teachers, and even some who had once turned a blind eye to the bullying that plagued the school. Kimura, watching from the sidelines, stepped forward to address the group. "What Jake has built here isn't just a dojo, it's a family," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had seen the world at its worst and best. "And families take care of each other." Jake led the class through a series of exercises, the room filled with laughter and determination. It was a stark contrast to the tension and fear that had once defined his days. As the class wound down, Emily approached Jake, her eyes shining with excitement. "Guess what?" she said, holding up a flyer. "I joined the school's debate team." Jake grinned, pulling her into a hug. "That's amazing, Em. You're going to be great." Rachel, who had been watching from the sidelines, joined them, her face glowing with pride. "It's incredible to see how far we've come," she said. Jake nodded, his gaze sweeping over the dojo. It wasn't just a place to learn martial arts anymore. It was a symbol of what they had overcome and what they could achieve together. As the evening wound to a close, Jake found himself alone in the dojo, the soft hum of the night settling around him. He walked to the center of the room, the floor cool beneath his feet, and sank into a meditative stance. Memories of the past months flickered through his mind, the fear, the anger, the triumphs, and the lessons learned. He thought of Liam's unwavering friendship, Emily's courage, Rachel's strength, and even Jonas's journey toward redemption. He breathed deeply, the weight of those memories settling into a quiet strength within him. Kimura's words echoed in his mind. The journey never ends, Jake. It only changes shape. And Jake knew he was ready for whatever came next. With a final breath, he rose, stepping out into the night. The stars above shone brightly, a reminder that even in the darkest times, light could be found. And for the first time in a long while, Jake felt not just hopeful, but whole. The road ahead was uncertain, but he would walk it with confidence, knowing he had built something lasting, a legacy of resilience, compassion, and strength. And that, he realized, was the greatest victory of all.
If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.